The heat at 450 feet is not the same as the heat on the ground. On the ground, the Nevada desert cooks you like a convection oven, a slow, wrapping warmth that seeps into your boots and radiates off the asphalt. Up here, on the maintenance deck of the receiver tower, the heat is radiative. It is a physical weight. It is the focused anger of 170,000 mirrors, all pitched at a precise angle to throw the sun at the boiler behind my back. I wiped a line of sweat from my safety glasses with the back of a grease-stained glove. My vision cleared, revealing the sprawling geometric ocean of the heliostat field below. From this altitude, the mirrors did not look like glass. They looked like mercury, a shimmering, silver lake stretching 3 miles in every direction, cutting a perfect circle out of the beige scrub of the Mojave. I checked the readout on my Fluke 87V multimeter. The thermocouple on the secondary salt loop was reading 560 degrees Fahrenheit. Nominal. The system was in standby warm, recirculating the molten nitrate salt to prevent it from freezing in the pipes. If the salt froze, it expanded. If it expanded, it ruptured the stainless steel piping. If the piping ruptured, the tower died. I adjusted the alligator clip on the terminal block, tightening the set screw with a 3mm flathead driver. My hands were steady. They were always steady. In my line of work, a tremor meant dropping a wrench 400 feet onto a mirror segment worth $5,000, or bridging a connection that would arc flash and melt the flesh off your phalanges. Central, this is Tower 1. TC sensor calibrated. Loop Bravo is green, I said into the Motorola radio clipped to my chest harness. Static. Just the white noise of the atmosphere, broken by the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the circulation pumps vibrating through the steel grating beneath my boots. Central, verify copy. Nothing. I did not panic. Radio shadows were common among the steel lattice, and the interference from the high-voltage transformers at the base often chewed up the UHF band. I clicked the radio off. I gathered my tools, the multimeter, a set of Imperial combination wrenches, a wire stripper, and a roll of high-temp Captain tape, and slotted them into the pouches of my leather belt. The weight was comforting. 20 pounds of steel and copper. Ballast. I walked to the edge of the grating and gripped the handrail. The railing was hot enough to be uncomfortable through my leather gloves. I looked down. Usually the access road connecting the tower to the main administration building was empty, save for the occasional white Ford F-150 doing a perimeter check. Today, there was a blockage. I squinted against the glare. I reached into my bag and pulled out my Bushnell 10x42 binoculars. I braced my elbows against the railing to stabilize the image and focus the dial. The blockage was the shift bus. It was a 20-seater shuttle that ferried techs from the parking lot to the tower base. It was sideways, slewed across the gravel, its front grille smashed into the concrete piling of a support strut. Steam, or maybe radiator smoke, was drifting lazily from the engine block. "What did you do, Jerry?" I muttered. Jerry drove the shuttle. Jerry was a careful driver. Then I saw the movement. It was not mechanical. It was biological, but it moved with the frenetic, wasted energy of a machine with a broken governor. Figures were swarming the bus. They were not wearing the high-visibility orange vests of the plant staff. They were dressed in drabs, denim, gray t-shirts, rags. They moved like ants dismantling a beetle. I adjusted the focus. One of the figures was dragging something out of the shattered windshield. It was Jerry. I knew it was him because of the reflective tape on his pants. The figure did not help him up. It raised both hands, holding something heavy, a tire iron or a rock, and brought it down. Once. Twice.
The motion was piston-like, efficient, brutal. I lowered the binoculars. The air in my lungs felt suddenly thin, as if the altitude had jumped from 400 feet to 40,000. I did not gasp. I did not scream. I processed the data. Input: unauthorized entry. Vehicle disabled.
Fatal violence observed. Analysis: the perimeter fence is breached. The administration building is likely compromised. Conclusion: the site is hostile. I turned back to the access hatch. The wind picked up, whistling through the steel lattice of the tower, a mournful, hollow sound like blowing over the lip of a massive bottle. I was alone. The elevator car was docked at the base, 450 feet below. If I called the car up, it would take 3 minutes to ascend. In those 3 minutes, anyone at the bottom could force the doors, bypass the safety interlocks, and ride it up with me. Or they could cut the power while I was in the shaft, turning the car into a coffin suspended in the dark. No, I said aloud. The word was snatched away by the wind. I walked to the control pedestal for the material hoist, a secondary, open-air platform used for hauling heavy parts. It had a manual override key switch. I inserted my master key and turned it to local lockout. The heavy contactor inside the panel clacked shut. I pulled the key. Now nobody could call the hoist from the ground. But the main personnel elevator was the problem. It was an Alimac rack and pinion drive. Rugged, reliable, and totally automated. Even if I locked it out up here, the ground control panel could override me if they had the codes, and the maintenance manual was in the lobby. I needed to kill it. I knelt on the grating, opening the access panel to the tower's junction box. A maze of conduit and thick black cables greeted me. I traced the labeling. Lift motor. 480 volts, 3-phase. I took my linesman pliers from my belt. These were insulated up to 1,000 volts. The circuit was live. If I cut the hot wire, the arc would blind me and the molten copper would spray into my face. I needed to isolate it first. I stood up and scanned the maintenance deck. I needed a disconnect. There. Bolted to the central structural column was the sub-panel. I marched over, opened the gray steel door, and found the breaker labeled elevator main. I threw the handle. The mechanical thunk was satisfying. To be sure, I took a red plastic lockout hasp from my safety kit, threaded it through the breaker handle, and snapped my personal padlock shut. I put the key in my pocket. Now, even if they restored main power at the substation, the circuit to the elevator motor was physically broken. The elevator was dead at the bottom. The hoist was dead at the top. The only way up now was the emergency ladder, 450 feet of vertical steel rungs inside a narrow safety cage. I walked to the ladder hatch. It was a heavy square of diamond plate steel set into the floor. I lifted it. It groaned on dry hinges. Looking down the shaft was like looking down the barrel of a gun. Dark, concentric rings of safety cages fading into the abyss. If they wanted me, they would have to climb. I could not weld the hatch shut. I did not have a torch. I could not bolt it. The frame was not threaded. I looked around the deck for leverage. My eyes landed on a pallet of replacement ceramic insulation tiles. They were stacked near the boiler housing, wrapped in heavy shrink wrap. Each tile weighed about 10 pounds. The pallet weighed half a ton. I could not move the pallet. But next to it was a stack of Schedule 40 steel pipes, spare conduits for the steam lines. They were 10 feet long, 2 inches in diameter. I grabbed one. It was heavy. Maybe 40 pounds. The galvanization was rough against my palms. I dragged it to the ladder hatch.
I laid it diagonally across the closed hatch door. It was not enough. A determined man could push the hatch up, sliding the pipe off. I needed friction. I needed tension. I knelt by the hatch. The grating of the floor had holes, diamond-shaped gaps. I took a length of 12-gauge solid copper wire from my scrap bag. I looped it around the steel pipe, then threaded it through the grating of the floor. I pulled it tight with my pliers, twisting the ends until the copper work hardened and bit into the steel. I did this 4 times, lashing the pipe to the floor structure, pinning the hatch shut beneath it. It was not a vault door,
But anyone trying to push that hatch open from below would have to lift 40 pounds of pipe and break 4 strands of heavy-gauge copper wire, all while hanging by one hand from a ladder 400 feet in the air. It would buy me time. I stood up and checked the sun. It was dropping. The angle of incidence was changing. The mirrors below were shifting, tracking the sun's descent. The standby hum of the tower changed pitch as the circulation pumps ramped down. I walked to the edge of the deck again. The carnage below had spread. The shift bus was now just a focal point for a larger stain. I saw 3 more vehicles stopped on the access road. Small fires were burning in the administration block. Smoke was rising, black and oily, contrasting with the pure, clean white of the steam venting from the turbine hall. I was thirsty. My hand went to the water bottle on my belt. It was a standard 32-ounce Nalgene. It was half full. 16 ounces. I looked at the receiver unit, the massive black cylinder dominating the center of the tower. It contained thousands of gallons of molten salt. The turbine hall below contained thousands of gallons of demineralized water for the steam cycle. But up here, on the maintenance deck, I did a mental inventory of the immediate area. 1 emergency eye wash station, the hydraulic fluid in the crane reservoir, the coolant in the transformer loops, the eye wash station. I rushed over to the green plastic basin mounted on the handrail. It was plumbed into a dedicated line running up the side of the tower. I pressed the paddle. A rusty trickle of water spat out, and then a steady stream. I sighed, the tension in my shoulders releasing slightly. It worked, but for how long? The pressure came from a booster pump at the base. If the power failed, the pump failed. If the pump failed, the water in this 400-foot vertical pipe would drain back down due to gravity, unless there was a check valve. I could not rely on a check valve. I needed to capture the potential energy now. I looked around for containers. There was nothing, just the spare parts, the tools, the grease buckets. The grease buckets. I ran to the storage locker. Inside were 3 5-gallon plastic pails of high-temp lithium grease. 2 were full. 1 was empty, save for a thick film of red sludge coating the sides. I grabbed the empty bucket. I needed to clean it. I could not drink lithium grease. It would shut down my kidneys before dehydration did. I grabbed a rag and started wiping. The grease was tenacious. It smeared rather than lifted. I needed a solvent. I checked my belt. I had a small spray bottle of contact cleaner, isopropyl alcohol, and some proprietary distillates. It was flammable and toxic, but it evaporated quickly. I sprayed the inside of the bucket, scrubbing furiously with the rag. The red sludge thinned, turning into a pink slurry. I wiped it out. I sprayed again. Wiped. Sprayed. Wiped. The smell of alcohol was sharp in the hot air. When the bucket was as clean as I could get it mechanically, I walked to the eye wash station. I positioned the bucket under the nozzle and pressed the paddle. The water was warm, heated by the ambient temperature of the pipes.
It filled the bucket slowly. 1 gallon. 2. At 3 gallons, the pressure died. The stream sputtered, turned into a dribble, and then stopped. The pump at the base had failed, or the power was out. I stared at the nozzle. Gravity was claiming the rest of the water. "Think," I whispered. The pipe was full of water. It just did not have the pressure to push it up the last few feet to the nozzle. I needed to lower the exit point. I looked at the PVC piping feeding the station. I took my hacksaw from the tool bag. I knelt at the base of the eyewash stand, where the pipe came up through the grating. I cut into the plastic. It was soft. The saw bit in easily. Zip, zip, zip. As soon as I broke the inner wall, water sprayed out, hissing against the hot grating. I jammed the bucket underneath the cut. The water was hot, maybe 100 degrees, but it was clear. I filled the 5-gallon bucket to the brim. I managed to fill my Nalgene. I filled the empty contact cleaner bottle. I had roughly 5.5 gallons of water.
At a rationing rate of half a gallon a day, survival baseline in this heat, I had 11 days. If I worked, if I sweated, that dropped to 5 days. I carefully moved the bucket into the shadow of the boiler housing. I covered it with a spare piece of sheet metal to prevent evaporation. This was my bank account, my liquid assets. The sun touched the horizon. The transition in the desert is abrupt. As soon as the sun dipped below the mountains, the heat vanished, replaced by a vacuum that sucked the warmth out of the air. The sky turned a bruised purple. Below, the mirror field went dormant. The heliostats, programmed by a computer that might no longer be running, defaulted to their stow position, vertical, facing the horizon, to minimize wind load and dust accumulation. The soundscape changed. The hum of the plant died. The screaming of the violence below had stopped, replaced by a terrifying silence. No sirens, no horns, just the wind. I shivered. The sweat on my shirt was turning cold. I needed a nest. The maintenance deck was open grating. The wind cut right through it. If I slept on the floor, I would lose body heat via convection from below and radiation from above. I looked at the receiver unit. The boiler itself was insulated, wrapped in layers of ceramic wool and aluminum cladding. It would stay warm for hours, maybe days, holding the heat of the molten salt. I cleared a space next to the eastern face of the boiler, sheltered from the prevailing wind. I laid down the pallet of insulation tiles to create a floor, a barrier against the steel grating. I found a roll of heavy movers felt in the storage locker, likely left behind by the installation crew years ago. I unrolled it on top of the tiles. I sat down. My back was against the warm aluminum of the boiler. It felt like leaning against a giant, sleeping animal. I ate a packet of peanut butter crackers from my pocket. They were stale, dry dust in my mouth. I washed them down with a tiny sip of water. I took the binoculars again. It was too dark to see details, but I could see lights. Fires. They were burning in the parking lot. I saw headlights moving on the highway, erratic beams cutting through the dark. Some stopped. Some veered off into the desert. I was not looking at a riot. I was looking at a phase change. Solid society melting into liquid chaos. I checked my perimeter one last time. Hatch, barricaded. Elevator, disabled. Hoist, locked out. Water, secured. I was safe. I was high. I was isolated. But as I leaned my head back against the vibrating steel of the receiver, I realized the flaw in my position. I was on top of a solar tower.
My entire existence depended on the sun. But the sun also powered the systems that kept the salt molten. Without the grid, without the computer control to aim the mirrors, the salt would cool.
Salt freezes at 430 degrees Fahrenheit. When it freezes, it turns into rock. It would expand and rip the pipes apart. The residual heat I was leaning against was finite. I checked the temperature gauge on the pipe next to my head. 540 degrees. It had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour. I pulled my knees to my chest. The wind howled through the lattice, a sound like 1,000 flutes playing a discord. I was not just a survivor. I was a technician on a dying machine. And I had to figure out how to keep its heart beating before the cold stopped mine. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I listened to the metal cooling, the ticking of contraction, counting the degrees as they slipped away into the desert night. The sun did not rise. It detonated. One moment, the eastern horizon was a band of bruised purple. The next, a blinding fusion reaction crested the Funeral Mountains, instantly pressurizing the atmosphere with light. The temperature swing was violent. The air on the maintenance deck went from a shivering 40 degrees to 80 in the span of 20 minutes. I peeled myself off the floor. My neck was a knot of tension, and my left hip ached where it had pressed against the ceramic tiles. I checked the boiler temperature gauge immediately. 415 degrees Fahrenheit. The salt was dying. The critical freeze point was 430 degrees. The numbers on the dial told me that somewhere deep in the chaotic plumbing of the receiver, the molten nitrate salt was beginning to slush. The viscosity was increasing. Soon, it would crystallize, expanding with the hydraulic force of a slow-motion explosion, shearing the stainless steel pipes from the inside out. The heat source was gone. The boiler was no longer a radiator. It was just a cooling corpse of metal. I stood up, gripping the railing to stabilize against a wave of orthostatic hypotension. I needed to urinate. My body was signaling a waste purge. I walked to the edge of the grating, intending to relieve myself through the mesh, watching the stream atomize 400 feet above the carnage. I stopped. My hand hovered over my zipper. I looked at the Nalgene bottle clipped to the railing. It was my only reserve. 5.5 gallons total in the stockpile. In this heat, with the reflected UV radiation from the mirror field, my perspiration rate would hit 2 liters an hour if I exerted myself. I could not piss away equity. I zipped my pants up. The pressure in my bladder was uncomfortable, a dull ache, but I forced it to the back of my mind. I needed a system. The industrial island rule of thermodynamics is simple. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, only lost to entropy. Survival is the act of slowing down entropy. I turned my back on the view and looked at my workshop. The maintenance deck was roughly 20 feet by 20 feet, a steel grid suspended in the sky. I had tools, I had scrap, I had the sun. I needed to build a regenerative water loop. I approached the scrap pile I had mentally cataloged the night before. I needed 3 chambers, an evaporator, a condenser, and a collector. And I needed them to be hermetically sealed. I dragged a heavy galvanized steel toolbox from the corner. It was a Joe Box brand, chest style, used for storing rigging chains. I emptied the chains out, the heavy steel links clattering against the grating like gunfire. I flinched, waiting for a reaction from the ground, but the wind swallowed the noise. The Joe Box was my chassis. It was steel, painted brown, with a hinged lid. I needed a glazing element,
something to let the solar radiation in but trap the infrared heat. I walked to the spare parts locker. On the top shelf, dusty and ignored, was a replacement sight glass assembly for the boiler inspection port. It was a thick, 12-inch square of borosilicate glass, framed in a heavy steel flange. High temperature resistant, optically clear. Perfect. I cleared a workspace on top of the empty grease drum. I laid out my tools. The angle grinder with a diamond cutoff wheel, a tube of high-temp RTV silicone, red, a rivet gun, and a drill with a set of cobalt bits. This was the work. This was the distraction. I started with the lid of the Joe box.
I measured the dimensions of the sight glass flange, 14 inches square. I marked a square on the center of the steel lid using a scribe. I picked up the angle grinder. I checked the battery. 3 bars. Enough. I depressed the trigger. The grinder whined, climbing to 10,000 RPM. I lowered the disc onto the steel. Sparks showered my legs, bouncing off my denim work pants. I did not feel them. I focused on the line. I needed a clean cut. If the edges were jagged, the seal would fail. If the seal failed, the vapor would escape. If the vapor escaped, I died. I cut the 4 sides of the square, the metal screaming as the abrasive disc ate through the 14-gauge steel. The square plate dropped into the box with a clang. I switched to a bastard file and deburred the edges, stripping away the razor-sharp slag until the steel was smooth to the touch. Next, the mounting. I positioned the borosilicate glass assembly over the hole. It fit with a 1/2-inch overlap. Good. I uncapped the RTV silicone. The smell of acetic acid, vinegar, hit me sharp and pungent. I ran a thick, continuous bead of the red paste around the perimeter of the hole. I did not skimp. I needed this to be airtight. I pressed the glass frame into the silicone, watching the red goo squeeze out the sides. I drilled 16 holes around the perimeter, driving 1/4-inch self-tapping screws through the flange and into the box lid. I tightened them in a star pattern, top left, bottom right, top right, bottom left, to ensure even pressure on the gasket. I wiped the excess silicone with my finger, creating a smooth fillet. Phase 1. The evaporator chamber. Now, the plumbing. I needed to separate the dirty water, urine, gray water, from the clean condensate. I found a length of 1/2-inch copper tubing in the scrap pile. It was oxidized, green with age, but structurally sound. Copper has high thermal conductivity. It would work as my condenser. I bent the copper tubing carefully. I did not have a bending spring, so I packed the tube with fine sand from a fire bucket to prevent it from kinking, then bent it around the curve of the grease drum. I created a coil, 4 loops of copper, roughly 10 inches in diameter. I drilled 2 holes in the side of the Joe box, one high, one low. I threaded the copper coil through the holes. The bulk of the coil would sit outside the box, in the shade behind the boiler, exposed to the wind. The intake of the coil would be inside the box, near the top, where the hot vapor would rise. I sealed the pass-throughs with more silicone and rubber grommets scavenged from an electrical junction box. The physics were sound. The sun would hit the Joe box through the glass. The interior temperature would spike to 160 or 170 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a localized greenhouse effect. The dirty liquid in the bottom of the box would evaporate. The vapor, free of salts and urea, would rise. It would hit the glass, but the glass would be hot. It would look for a cooler exit. The copper tube. The vapor would enter the copper intake, and as it traveled through the external coil, the desert wind blowing over the copper would suck the heat out, causing the vapor to phase change back into liquid water. Gravity would do the rest, dripping the distillate into a collection vessel. But I needed to maximize the efficiency.
The bottom of the Joe box needed to be matte black to absorb the heat. I did not have black paint. I looked at the grease bucket I had cleaned yesterday. I looked at the soot-stained rags I had used. I took a handful of rags and a lighter from my pocket. I piled the rags inside the Joe box and set them on fire. They smoldered, releasing thick, oily smoke. I closed the lid. The fire choked on its own fumes, starving for oxygen, but not before coating the interior of the box with a layer of carbon soot. Perfect black body absorption. I wiped the glass clean. Now, the intake. I could not keep opening the lid to add fluid. I'd lose the heat. I drilled a third hole in the side and inserted a funnel made from the cut-off top of a plastic soda bottle, connected to a short length of hose with a ball valve I found on a pneumatic line. I could pour liquid into the funnel, open the valve, let it drain into the evaporation pan, and close the valve. The vacuum would hold.
I carried the contraption to the sunniest spot on the deck, facing due south. I tilted it on a stack of bricks to angle the glass perpendicular to the sun's arc. I placed my Nalgene bottle under the copper output tube. Now came the test. I unzipped my pants. I aimed into the intake funnel. The urine was dark, amber-colored. Dehydration was already setting in. I opened the ball valve. The liquid drained into the black belly of the machine. I closed the valve. I sat back and watched. Nothing happened at first. Engineering is a game of patience. 10 minutes passed. I checked the glass. Condensation was starting to fog the corners of the pane. The heat inside was building. The physics were working. 20 minutes. The first drop of clear liquid formed at the tip of the copper coil. It hung there, trembling against the wind, catching the sunlight like a diamond. Then, it fell. Plink. It hit the bottom of the Nalgene. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. It was not a river. It was a drip. But a drip was life. I calculated the yield. At this rate, maybe a quart a day. Not enough to sustain me indefinitely, but enough to stretch my supplies from 11 days to 20. I had bought time. Now I needed to buy comfort. The wind was relentless. It was not just cold, it was abrasive. It carried fine silica dust that scoured the skin and clogged the sinuses. And the noise, the constant tonal drone of the wind vibrating the tension cables, was beginning to fray my nerves. It was a psychological sandpaper. I needed a nest. I looked at the space between the boiler housing and the structural support beam. It was a narrow corridor, maybe 3 feet wide and 8 feet long, sheltered on 2 sides. I grabbed the pallet of ceramic insulation tiles. These were not bathroom tiles. They were high-tech refractory blocks, designed to line the inside of blast furnaces. They were lightweight, porous, and incredible insulators. I started stacking them like dry stone masonry, building a wall to close off the third side of the corridor. I mixed a slurry of water and desert dust to use as a crude mortar, not for structural strength, but to seal the gaps against the wind. I worked methodically. Lift, place, shim. Lift, place, shim. My hands were raw, the gloves wearing thin, but the rhythm was soothing. When the wall was 4 feet high, I stopped. I needed a roof. I found a sheet of corrugated galvanized steel, likely a piece of siding blown off the turbine hall during a past storm and stashed up here. It was bent and rusted, but solid. I dragged it over the top of my tile walls, weighting it down with heavy bucket lids and scrap iron to keep the wind from peeling it off. I crawled inside. The difference was instant. The wind noise dropped from a scream to a mumble. The air was still. I lined the floor with the rest of the mover's felt. I took the remaining ceramic wool, itchy, nasty stuff, and stuffed it into the gaps where the corrugated roof met the wall. It was dark. It was tight. It smelled of dust and grease. It was a coffin. But it was my coffin. I lay down on the felt. I checked my watch. 14 hours. The sun was at its peak. I needed to check the still. I crawled out. The Nalgene had an inch of water in it. Clear, warm water. I unscrewed the cap and took a sip. It tasted flat, metallic, with a faint hint of rubber from the grommets, but it was fresh. It was the taste of success. I scanned the horizon. The heat haze distorted the ground, turning the mirror field into a liquid mirage. Then I saw it. Movement on the stairs. Not the elevator shaft. The external spiral staircase that wrapped around the central column for the first 50 feet before transitioning to the internal ladder. I grabbed the binoculars. A dog. A coyote? No, it was too big. A German shepherd, maybe? It was moving erratically, snapping at the air, stumbling. And behind it, following with the same jerky, mindless persistence I had seen yesterday, were 3 figures. They were climbing. My stomach dropped. The elevator was dead. The hoist was locked. But I had forgotten the maintenance access for the lower heliostat drive motors. It was a separate stairwell, external, that went up to the first tier of the tower, about 60 feet up. From there, they could not get to me. The internal ladder began inside the tower shaft, accessible only through a locked door at the base or the hatch I had barricaded. But they were here. They were not just passing through on the highway. They were drawn to the structure. Maybe it was the visual prominence of the tower. Maybe it was the smell of the unwashed grease bucket I'd left out. I watched them. The dog reached the top of the spiral stairs, hitting the locked gate that separated the low-access platform from the high-voltage risers. It threw itself against the chain link. The figures caught up. They did not try to open the latch. They just pressed themselves against the fence, fingers interlaced in the wire, shaking it. They were screaming. I could not hear it over the wind, but I could see their mouths opening and closing, throats straining. They knew I was here. I lowered the binoculars. The isolation of the industrial island was a double-edged sword. It kept them out, but it trapped me in. I looked at my solar still. Drip, drip. I looked at my coffin of ceramic tiles. I had shelter. I had water. I had a fortress in the sky. But as I watched the figures shaking the fence 60 feet below, I realized my engineering had missed a variable. I had planned for the heat. I had planned for the thirst. I had planned for the wind. I had not planned for the siege. I walked to the edge of the deck. I needed a weapon. A wrench was not enough. I needed range. I needed leverage. I looked at the stack of conduit pipes. I looked at the heavy nuts and bolts in the bin. Physics. Gravity. If I could not shoot them, I would have to drop the sky on them. I picked up a heavy 2-inch steel nut. I weighed it in my hand. From 450 feet, terminal velocity would make this bullet irrelevant. This was a kinetic bombardment. But not yet. Conserve energy, I whispered to the wind. Wait for the variable to change. I sat down by the still, watching the water accumulate, drop by drop, while the fence rattled silently below. The sun began its descent, and the tower groaned as the steel cooled.
a giant metal skeleton settling in for another long, dark night. The death of a thermal power station is not a quiet event. It is a symphony of contraction. For 2 days, I had listened to the steel singing. It started as a rhythmic ticking, like a cooling engine block magnified 1,000 times, the sound of the molecular lattice in the girders shrinking as the heat dissipated into the desert. By the third night, the ticking had evolved into groans, deep, resonant moans that vibrated through the floor grating and up through the soles of my boots. But at 3 hours, the physics changed.
I was awake, huddled in my ceramic coffin, listening to the wind. The temperature outside was dropping toward freezing. The temperature inside the receiver pipes was hitting the critical phase change point. Crack! The sound was like a high-velocity rifle shot. It did not come from the wind. It came from the plumbing. I sat up, banging my head on the corrugated roof of my shelter. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight, a heavy mag light with a knurled grip, and scrambled out into the dark. The maintenance deck was a chaotic landscape of shadows. The wind was whipping through the lattice at 30 miles per hour, whistling like a banshee. I swept the beam across the boiler housing. Crack! Thoom! Another rupture. This one shook the deck plates. I saw it then. On the north face of the receiver, a 4-inch return line had split. The stainless steel, stressed beyond its yield point by the differential cooling between the metal and the solidifying salt plug inside, had sheared longitudinally. It was not an explosion of fire. It was a hemorrhage of heat. Molten salt, still liquid in the center of the pipe at roughly 450 degrees, was spraying out of the fissure. It hit the cold air and instantly atomized into a lethal, white fog. Where the droplets hit the grating, they hissed and solidified into white crust, like instant ice. "The still," I gasped. The spray was directed westward, right at my Joe Box water generator. I did not think. I moved. I dove across the grating, shielding my face with my arm. The heat radiating from the spray was intense, a dry, oven blast that singed the hair on my forearms. I reached the still. The borosilicate sight glass was intact, but the copper condensing coil was directly in the path of the salt spray. The molten nitrate was hitting the copper, coating it in a rapidly thickening shell of white rock. If the copper got too hot, the solder joints would melt. If the salt encased it completely, thermal transfer would stop. The still would die. I grabbed the handle of the Joe Box. It was hot. I gritted my teeth and pulled. The heavy steel box scraped against the grating. I dragged it 3 feet, 5 feet, out of the direct line of fire. I collapsed back against a structural beam, coughing. The air tasted metallic and bitter, nitrous oxide fumes releasing from the degrading salt. I shone the light on the damage. The copper coil was caked in white crud, but it had not melted. I chipped at the salt with my multi-tool. It flaked off. The copper underneath was discolored but intact. I had saved the water, but the tower was bleeding to death. I looked at the ruptured pipe. The flow was slowing as the salt hit the air and froze, self-sealing the wound with a plug of nitrate rock. The industrial island was solidifying. The veins of the machine were turning into stone. Then the wind changed. It was not just a gust. The pressure dropped so fast my ears popped. The howling through the lattice deepened an octave, turning into a roar. I looked south. The moon was out, a sliver of pale light, but the southern horizon was gone. In its place was a wall, a solid, opaque curtain of blackness rising from the desert floor to the stratosphere, blotting out the stars. A haboob. A massive dust storm,
pushed by a collapsing thunderstorm front miles away. It was moving fast, swallowing the mirror field, turning the Mercury Lake into a dull, matte gray. I checked my watch. 3:15. I had maybe 10 minutes before it hit. I needed to secure everything. If the wind speed exceeded 60 miles per hour, anything not bolted down would become a projectile. My loose tools, the bucket lids, the spare sheet metal, it would all be stripped away. I went into a frenzy of lashing. I grabbed a coil of 12-gauge wire. I tied the Joe box to the railing. I wired the stack of ceramic tiles together, weaving the copper strands through the gaps. I kicked my loose tools into the bottom of the empty grease drum and lashed the drum to the column. The roar grew louder. It was not wind anymore. It was the sound of a freight train derailment that never ended. I retreated to my shelter. I crawled inside and curled up, pulling the mover's felt over my head. The wall hit. The tower did not just shake, it lurched.
The steel structure was designed to flex. A rigid tower would snap, but the sensation at 450 feet was sickening. It felt like being on a ship in a hurricane. I rolled across the floor, slamming into the tile wall. Then came the grit. Even inside the shelter, the dust found a way. It was a fine, talcum powder silt. It filled my nose, my mouth, my eyes. It coated the inside of my throat. I pulled my shirt up over my face, breathing through the fabric. The noise was deafening. The corrugated roof rattled against its tie-downs, screaming metal on metal. I lay there for an hour, 2. Time dissolved into the roar. I monitored the vibration. I focused on the harmonics of the steel. As long as the groaning was rhythmic, the structure was holding. If I heard a sharp ping or a screech, it meant a bolt had sheared. Then, through the cacophony, I heard something else. Clang. Pause. Clang. It was not the wind. The wind was a continuous force. This was percussive, specific. It was coming from the floor. I froze. I pressed my ear to the felt, trying to isolate the sound. Clang. Scrape. It was the hatch. The diamond plate steel hatch I had barricaded with the pipe and the copper wire. Something was pushing against it from below. I remembered the figures on the stairs. The dog. The mindless persistence. They had found the internal ladder. The impossible climb, 450 feet of vertical rungs in the dark, had not stopped them. They did not feel lactic acid burn. They did not feel fear. They were at the door. I grabbed the mag light and my only weapon, the 24-inch pipe wrench I had slept with. I crawled out of the shelter. The storm was at its peak. Visibility was 0. The beam of my flashlight died 3 feet in front of me, swallowed by the swirling brown soup of dust. The wind tried to rip the door out of my hand. I had to lean at a 45-degree angle just to stand. I crab-walked toward the hatch, keeping my center of gravity low. The pipe I had lashed across the hatch was bowing. The copper wire was taut, singing like a guitar string under extreme tension. The hatch plate was lifting, maybe an inch, then slamming back down. Clang! Something was at the top of the ladder, pushing with the strength of the dead. I reached the hatch. I shone the light through the diamond mesh of the floor grating. I saw fingers. Gray, necrotic flesh. Fingernails torn away, leaving raw, black beds. They were hooked through the grating of the hatch from the underside, clawing for purchase. I saw a face pressed against the steel mesh. It was distorted, the skin flattened against the metal. The eyes were milky,
staring up into the light without blinking. It was a man in a tattered security polo shirt. He was not screaming. He was just pushing.
A hydraulic press of flesh and bone. The copper wire holding the pipe pinged. One strand snapped. The hatch jumped up 2 inches. The pipe slid slightly to the left. If that hatch opened, they would spill out onto the deck. In this storm, in the dark, I could not fight a swarm. I would be backed off the edge and blown into the void. I needed to seal it. Permanently. I looked around. I needed weight. I needed a welder. I had neither. Then I looked at the ruptured salt pipe. It was 10 feet away, still oozing white slush. The main spray had stopped, but a steady drool of semi-molten nitrate was pooling on the grating, glowing with a dull, cherry-red heat in the core of the puddle. The industrial island provides. I needed to redirect that flow. I scrambled over to the scrap pile. I found a piece of C-channel steel, a 4-foot length of guttering used for cable management. I grabbed it with my gloved hands. It was cold and slick with dust. I rushed back to the hatch. The pipe gave another inch. A second hand had joined the first. The security guard was getting leverage. I could hear the wet, guttural sound of his exertion over the wind. I jammed the end of the C-channel under the rupture in the salt pipe. The hot slush hit the steel channel and flowed. It was viscous, like lava. I angled the channel down, aiming the other end directly at the hatch. "Drink up!" I yelled, the sound lost in the storm. The molten salt slid down the chute. It hit the grating of the hatch. It hit the fingers. There was no scream. The nerves were likely dead, but physics still applied. The heat, 400 degrees of thermal mass, vaporized the fluids in the flesh instantly. Steam exploded from the fingers. The hands jerked back, not from pain, but from the violent expansion of boiling blood. The salt poured through the mesh. It coated the ladder rungs below. It coated the face of the thing climbing. I watched as the white sludge cascaded down the shaft. Then, the magic happened. The salt hit the cold steel of the hatch and the ladder and froze. Instantly. It did not just cover them. It bonded to them. The nitrate salt, when solid, has the compressive strength of concrete. It filled the mesh of the grating. It filled the gap between the hatch and the frame. It encased the locking mechanism. I kept the channel in place for 5 minutes, shivering in the dust storm, watching the white mound grow. I was casting a seal. I was welding the door shut with the blood of the tower. When the flow slowed to a trickle, I kicked the channel away. I shined the light on the hatch. It was gone. In its place was a white, crystalline tumor fused to the deck. The pipe I had lashed down was now embedded in rock. I kicked the mound. It was solid. I put my ear to the grating near the edge of the seal. Silence. No pushing. No breathing. The climber had either fallen or was now encased in the salt statue below, a fossil in the making. I sat back on my heels, the adrenaline crashing out of my system. My hands were shaking. My safety goggles were frosted with scratches from the sand. The storm raged on, but the immediate crisis was capped. I crawled back to my shelter. The dust inside was an inch thick. I did not care. I drank a mouthful of gritty water from my Nalgene. I lay down, but I could not close my eyes. I stared at the dark ceiling. I had survived the test, but I had used the last of the tower's heat to do it. The salt was freezing faster now.
The rupture had depressurized the system. By tomorrow, the receiver would be a cold, dead monolith. I was the master of a castle made of ice. And I had a new problem. As the wind began to die down, dropping from a roar to a moan, I heard a sound from the northwest. It was not a zombie. It was not a pipe bursting. It was a rhythmic, chopping beat. Thwop, thwop, thwop. I froze. A helicopter. I scrambled out of the shelter, ignoring the dying gusts of sand. I scanned the sky. There, a mile out, a dark shape moving against the lightning sky. It was running without navigation lights. Hope surged in my chest, a painful, desperate spike. Rescuers? Military? I grabbed my maglite. I aimed it at the chopper and strobed it. SAS. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The chopper banked. It saw me.
It turned toward the tower. The sound of the rotors grew louder, beating the air into submission. It was a civilian model, a Bell 407, painted matte black. It hovered 100 feet off the deck. The downdraft kicked up the dust I had just survived. I waved my arms. Here! I'm here! The side door of the helicopter slid open. I stopped waving. A man was sitting in the doorway. He was not wearing a rescue harness. He was not lowering a winch. He was holding a rifle, a scoped DMR. He raised the rifle. He was not aiming at the zombies below. He was aiming at me. Analysis. Hostile. Action. Cover. I threw myself behind the boiler housing just as the concrete near my feet exploded into dust. Crack. The sound of the shot lagged behind the impact. They were not here to save me. They were here for the tower. Or they were simply clearing the board. I pressed my back against the cold steel of the boiler. The helicopter circled, the rotor wash pounding against the structure. I was alive. The storm had not killed me. The dead had not killed me. The machine had not killed me. But now, I had to survive the living. The bullet impact had left a crater in the concrete deck, a jagged pockmark 3 inches wide, exposing the rebar skeleton beneath. It was the only mark the world had made on me in 6 months. I did not move until the sound of the rotors had faded into the subsonic vibration of the atmosphere. The Bell 407 did not have the fuel loiter time to play hide-and-seek in a dust storm. They had circled twice, the sniper firing blindly into the lattice, ringing the steel like a church bell before banking hard to the west. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for scavengers. In the new economy, a standing power tower was a resource, and I was an infestation. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before. It was not just the absence of noise. It was the presence of a void. I crawled out from behind the boiler. My knees popped. I was lighter now. I knew this without a scale. I could feel the change in my center of gravity. My belt, a heavy leather tool rig, was cinched to the last hole, and I had punched 2 new ones with an awl. Assessment. The threat is aerial. Countermeasure. Camouflage. My white ceramic shelter was a beacon. It stood out against the gray steel and the rust-colored desert like a surrender flag. I spent the next 3 days erasing myself. I returned to the grease storage. I mixed the remaining black lithium grease with dust from the storm, creating a thick, matte paste. I applied it to the white insulation tiles of my shelter, smearing it in irregular patterns to break up the silhouette. I painted the reflective surfaces of my Joe box still. I took the remaining conduit pipes and arranged them in a chaotic pile over the roof of my nest,
mimicking the debris of a structural collapse.
From the air, the maintenance deck now looked like a junk pile on a ruined tower. I had become part of the wreckage. The routine set in. Survival is not an adventure. It is a repetitive, low-yield industrial process. 6:11. Wake up. The cold in the ceramic coffin is biting. The desert floor is still radiating the night's chill. I do not stretch. I check the seal. I crawl to the hatch. The mound of frozen nitrate salt, my salt plug, has weathered. The surface has oxidized to a dull gray, but it remains rock hard. I check the perimeter where the salt meets the steel floor. No cracks. No stress fractures. The thing beneath the ice is still there, entombed, a silent sentry guarding my floor. 7:11. Water harvest. I crawl to the Joe box. The solar still is my clock and my god. I tap the glass. Condensation runs down the pane into the copper gutter. I drain the collection hose into my Nalgene. Yield, 14 ounces. It's dropping. The angle of the sun is changing as autumn approaches. The days are getting shorter. Less solar flux means less evaporation. I calculate the curve in my head. By December, the yield will drop to 8 ounces. That is the death line. I need to increase efficiency. I spend the morning resealing the glazing with scavenged gaskets made from the rubber soles of my spare work boots. I cut the rubber into strips with my razor knife, the blade dulling on the tough Vibram compound. Every cut requires focus. A slip means a laceration. A laceration means infection. Infection, without antibiotics, means sepsis. Sepsis means I fall off the tower. 10 o'clock. The hunt. Food is the variable I cannot engineer. I had eaten the last of the crackers weeks ago. I had eaten a tube of sugary energy gel found in a forgotten emergency kit. Now, I was a predator. The tower was a dead tree, but dead trees attract life. Ravens. They roosted in the upper lattice, 300 feet above me, but they came down to the maintenance deck to pick at the grease fittings or inspect the shiny bits of scrap. They were smart. They knew the range of a thrown wrench, but they did not understand tension. I had built the snare using the internal strands of a Cat6 Ethernet cable I ripped from the control pedestal. The copper was thin, 24 gauge, twisted into a loop. I anchored it to the railing near the grease drum. The bait was the problem. I had nothing to give them. So I gave them curiosity. I tied a small strip of aluminum foil, the wrapper from the energy gel, to the trigger mechanism. It fluttered in the wind, flashing in the sun. I lay in the shelter, watching through a gap in the tiles. A large black male landed on the railing. He hopped sideways, eyeing the foil. He was cautious. He pecked at the railing, testing the surface. He hopped closer. He struck at the foil. The trigger was a simple figure-4 deadfall mechanism, adapted for a snare. As he pulled the foil, the tension on the bent copper wire released. The loop whipped upward. It caught his leg. The bird did not scream. It thrashed, a flurry of black feathers and frantic flapping. I was on him in seconds. I did not feel triumph. I felt urgency. I grabbed the bird by the body, pinning the wings to prevent him from breaking them. I felt the rapid fire beat of his heart against my palm, hundreds of beats per minute. A tiny, furious engine. I twisted the neck. A quick, mechanical snap. The engine stopped. I carried the carcass to the kitchen, a sheet of steel behind the boiler. I used the razor knife to dress the kill. There is no waste. I stripped the feathers and stuffed them into my clothing,
between the layers of my shirt and the mover's felt vest I had stitched together. Down insulation. I cut out the breast meat. It was dark, lean, almost purple. There was very little fat. I ate the heart and liver raw. I needed the vitamins. The taste was metallic, bloody, and hot. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. The rest of the meat I sliced into thin strips. I could not cook it. Fuel was too precious, and smoke would give away my position. I laid the strips on the black boiler casing. The sun, even in its weakening state, heated the black metal to 140 degrees. It was a slow dehydrator. By sunset, I had 3 ounces of raven jerky. It was tough as leather, stringy, and tasted of game. But it was protein.
November brought the wind. This was not the hot wind of the summer. This was the Santa Ana in reverse, a cold, high-pressure system plunging down from the Great Basin. It scoured the tower. The temperature on the deck dropped to 20 degrees at night. My water still froze. The cycle stopped. I had to bring the Joe box inside the shelter at night to keep the dirty water reservoir from freezing solid and cracking the vessel, then drag it out at dawn. The cold revealed the flaw in my architecture. The ceramic tiles were insulators, yes, but they had no thermal mass to hold heat, and the wind was finding every gap. I needed to seal the coffin. I turned to the only resource I had in abundance: plastic. The control cables running up the tower were sheathed in heavy-duty PVC jackets. I spent 3 days harvesting them. I hacked at the conduits with my saw, stripping long lengths of black plastic jacketing. I used the silicone sealant, my last half-tube, to glue the plastic strips over the seams of my tile walls. I created a windbreaker. But the cold came from below, through the floor grating. I lifted the mover's felt. I laid down a layer of the flattened cardboard boxes from the spare parts bin, then a layer of plastic, then the felt. I was building a composite laminate floor. I slept in the fetal position, knees to chest, conserving core heat. I dreamed of warmth. Not a fire, but the specific, dry warmth of the server room in the administration building. The hum of the cooling fans, the blink of the LEDs. One night, the wind died. The silence woke me. I crawled out. The moon was full, illuminating the desert in a spectral blue light. I looked down. The mirror field was gone. The wind and the dust had done their work. The thousands of heliostats, once a perfect geometric array, were now a chaotic sea of drift dunes. Some mirrors had tipped over, shattered. Others were buried. But there was movement. A herd. Not the shambling, jerky figures of the infected. This was a fluid mass. Wild horses. Mustangs. They were moving through the ruins of the solar plant, navigating the broken glass and steel with an uncanny grace. There must have been 50 of them. They were heading south, toward the Colorado River. I watched them through the binoculars. They were thin, their coats shaggy, but they were alive. They were adapting. They did not care about the grid, or the collapse, or the zombies. They simply migrated. I felt a pang of intense jealousy. They were free. I was an anchor bolt, rusted in place. Then I saw the shadows trailing them. The infected. A pack of them, moving on all fours, loping like wolves. They were not mindless anymore. They were hunting. I saw the pack flank the herd. They used the terrain, driving the horses toward a bottleneck near the perimeter fence. Analysis. They are learning. The realization chilled me more than the wind. If they could coordinate a hunt, they could coordinate a siege. My salt plug was a temporary measure. Eventually, they would figure out the external structure. They would figure out the crane. I went back into my hole. I sharpened my knife. I checked my stash of Raven jerky. I was not a survivor. I was a stockpile waiting to be raided. Winter solstice. The sun barely cleared the mountains. The shadows were long and purple. I was starving. The ravens had migrated. The snares had been empty for 2 weeks. I was surviving on the stored fat of my own body, cannibalizing my muscle tissue. My hands shook when I held the screwdriver. My vision grayed out if I stood up too fast. I sat against the boiler, wrapped in my layers of felt and feathers. I looked at the radio on my chest. The battery had died months ago. It was a brick. But the tower had power. I had disconnected the elevator, but the high-voltage risers from the grid were still physically connected, even if the grid was dead. But what about the local systems? Solar panels, the aviation warning lights. At the very top of the tower, 50 feet above the maintenance deck, was the FAA beacon. It was powered by a dedicated battery bank and a small array of photovoltaic panels, independent of the main plant power. If the batteries were still good. I looked up the external ladder. It was coated in rime ice. A 50-foot climb in the freezing wind, with malnutrition tremors. Risk? High. Reward? Information, connection, or just a light in the dark. I needed to know I was not the last engineer on Earth. I prepped my gear. I took the copper wire from the snares and fashioned a safety lanyard. I clipped it to my belt. I started the climb. The rungs were slick. The cold burned my hands through the thin leather of my gloves. I climbed methodically. Hand, hand, foot, foot. Do not look down. Look at the weld seams. Look at the rust. I reached the top platform. It was a tiny grate, barely 3 feet wide. The wind here was ferocious. There it was, the control box for the L-864 aviation obstruction light. I opened the panel. The gasket popped, frozen. Inside, the charge controller LED was blinking. Green. The system was alive. The panels were keeping the deep cycle batteries topped off. The light was not flashing because the photocell was dirty, covered in bird droppings and dust. I wiped the sensor clean with my thumb. Click. The relay engaged. Above my head, the massive red strobe pulsed. Flash. A second of darkness. Flash. It was blindingly bright. A heartbeat of red light visible for 30 miles in the clear desert air. I laughed. A dry, cracking sound. I had just turned on a lighthouse in a dead ocean. I sat on the grating, huddled under the flashing red light. I scanned the horizon. North, darkness. West, darkness. South, darkness. East. There, it was faint. A tiny, steady pinprick of yellow light, miles away in the foothills of the mountains. It was not a fire. It was too steady. It was an electric light. Someone else was out there. Someone else had kept the voltage flowing. I watched it for an hour. It did not blink. It did not move. I was not alone. But I did not signal back. I did not have a flashlight strong enough. And even if I did, the helicopter had taught me the lesson. A light is a target. I reached into the control box. I found the toggle switch for the beacon mode. I flipped it from auto to off. The red pulse died. The darkness rushed back in, absolute and crushing. I would not guide them here.
I would not guide anyone here. I looked at the distant yellow light one last time. Good luck, I whispered. I closed the panel. I climbed down the ice-slicked ladder back to the maintenance deck. Back to my ceramic coffin. Back to the stasis. I was the keeper of the tower. My job was not to be found. My job was to keep the structure standing. I crawled into my shelter and pulled the felt over my head. Tomorrow, I would check the snares. Tomorrow, I would clean the still. Tomorrow, I would survive. The wind howled outside, but inside, the silence was mine.